We have an uncovered topic you won't find anywhere else today. Let's dive deep, buckle up, and don't forget to subscribe. Have you ever wondered if history is shaped by a few powerful individuals, or if it would have played out the same way no matter who was in charge? If certain key figures had never existed, would the world look completely different today? Or were events like wars, revolutions, and empires simply inevitable? This is the paradox of the great man versus the invisible hand. It questions whether history is directed by extraordinary leaders or by larger social forces that make their rise unavoidable. So let's put this paradox to the test. Most people believe that Adolf Hitler was the single reason for World War II. His leadership, ideology, and aggressive military expansion led to the most devastating conflict in human history. But what if I told you that, even if Hitler had never existed, World War II might have still happened anyway? Germany, after World War I, was in a deep economic crisis, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, and filled with resentment. The Great Depression only made things worse. Nationalism was rising, and millions of people were looking for a strong leader. Now, imagine a world where Hitler never took power. Wouldn't someone else, a different leader, perhaps, have still capitalized on that same national frustration? Could another radical politician have taken Germany down a similar path? If the conditions were already in place for war, does it really matter who was leading, or was the conflict destined to happen anyway? That's the paradox. Was Hitler the reason for World War II? Or was he simply the face of a movement that would have happened regardless? Let's go even further back in history. One of the biggest turning points in human civilization was the Industrial Revolution. This period changed everything: factories, mass production, railroads, and modern economies. Many people credit this transformation to a few genius inventors like James Watt, who perfected the steam engine, or Henry Ford, who revolutionized production with the assembly line. These men are often seen as great minds who changed the world. But was the Industrial Revolution really the result of a few brilliant individuals? Or was it bound to happen no matter what? Populations were growing, trade was expanding, and scientific knowledge was advancing. Even if James Watt never invented the steam engine, someone else probably would have, right? So, was this moment in history really about one man's genius, or was it simply a shift that was inevitable due to economic and technological progress? Let's take an empire, the Roman Empire, one of the greatest powers the world has ever seen. It lasted for centuries, but eventually, it fell. Historians often blame specific leaders, like Emperor Nero or Commodus, for its decline. But here's the question: was the fall of Rome truly because of bad emperors? Or was Rome destined to collapse due to economic instability, military overreach, and political corruption? If a great leader had stepped in at the last minute, could Rome have been saved? Or was its downfall inevitable, no matter who was in charge? If the great man theory is true, that means a single person can change the world, completely altering the course of history. But if the invisible hand theory is correct, then maybe history isn't about individuals at all. It's just a giant machine moving forward, with or without them. So, what do you think? Does history depend on powerful individuals? Or was everything that happened already written in fate? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more mind-bending history. Now, let's move on to the next paradox. Imagine this: you're given a choice. You can live in a world that is completely safe, where no crime, no terrorism, and no chaos can ever touch you. But in exchange, you have to give up your privacy, your ability to speak freely, and even some of your personal choices. On the other hand, you can live in a world with absolute freedom, where you can do whatever you want, say whatever you want, and go wherever you want. But here's the catch: there are no rules, no police, and no protections. Crime is rampant, danger is everywhere, and chaos reigns. Which one do you choose? This is the freedom versus security paradox. The idea that the more security a society has, the less freedom it can allow. And the more freedom a society demands, the less security it can maintain. History is filled with examples of societies wrestling with this paradox, and almost every major government has faced it at some point. Take ancient Rome. In times of war and crisis, Roman leaders often declared a state of emergency, suspending freedoms in the name of security. The citizens accepted it because they wanted protection. But over time, these emergency measures became the norm. The Republic slowly transformed into an empire, where rulers like Julius Caesar and Augustus took more and more power until democracy was all but gone. Now, let's fast forward to modern times. After 9/11, the US government passed the Patriot Act, allowing mass surveillance of phone calls, emails, and internet activity in the name of national security. Many people accepted it, believing it would keep them safe. But others argued that it was an attack on personal freedom and privacy. So, was it necessary? Or was it an example of history repeating itself? The paradox is this. People demand protection from threats, but that protection often comes at the cost of their own rights. And once freedoms are taken away, history shows that they rarely return. But here's the big question. Where is the balance? How much freedom should people be willing to trade for security? And how much security can a government enforce before it becomes something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. Imagine an advanced civilization with towering cities, complex trade networks, and cutting-edge technology. Everything seems to be improving, until suddenly, it collapses. Not from war, not from an external enemy, but from within. Why do some of the most advanced societies in history experience periods of sudden decline instead of continued progress? Why do civilizations that seem unstoppable suddenly vanish, leaving behind only ruins and mystery? This is the technological regression paradox. The idea that the more advanced a civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it might actually be to collapse. Let's start with a mystery that has baffled historians for centuries: the fall of the Mayan civilization. At their peak, the Maya had complex mathematics, advanced astronomy, massive pyramids, and a vast trading empire. Then, around the 9th century, something happened. Cities were abandoned, trade routes vanished, and the civilization collapsed. Some theories suggest overpopulation and environmental damage played a role. Others argue that their complex society made them too dependent on specific resources. And when those resources ran out, the system crumbled. Could it be that their own technological advancements led to their downfall? Now, take another example, the fall of Rome. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. They built incredible infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, military outposts. But as the empire became more advanced, it also became more fragile. Political corruption, economic instability, and over-reliance on foreign resources all played a role in its decline. The very systems that made Rome strong also made it weak when things started to break down. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This paradox isn't just ancient history. Look at the modern world. We are more technologically advanced than ever before, but we are also more dependent on fragile systems. The internet, electricity grids, global supply chains. What happens if they suddenly stop working? How long before modern civilization starts to unravel? Could it be that our greatest strengths, our advancements in technology, our interconnected systems, are also our greatest weaknesses? And if history teaches us anything, are we heading for a collapse of our own? What do you think? Is progress always good? Or is there a breaking point where advancement actually leads to downfall? And drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. Imagine this. You're having a conversation with someone about a historical event that you clearly remember. You learned about it in school, you saw documentaries on it, maybe even read first-hand accounts. But then, someone tells you that never happened. You rush to look it up, but every book, every document, every website now tells a completely different story. The event is gone, erased like it never existed. Even worse, you start doubting yourself. Were you wrong? Did you misremember? Or did someone rewrite history? This is the memory hole paradox. The idea that if history is constantly rewritten, then how do we know what really happened? If records can be changed, if facts can be erased, then do we truly have an accurate view of the past? Let's start with where this term actually comes from. George Orwell's novel, 1984. In Orwell's dystopian world, history isn't just controlled, it's constantly altered in real time. The government, known as Big Brother, has an entire department dedicated to erasing and modifying historical records. If someone becomes inconvenient to the government, they don't just disappear physically. They disappear from history. Every mention of them in newspapers, books, and official documents is deleted, and suddenly, it's as if they never existed. But here's the terrifying part. This isn't just fiction. This has happened in real life. One of the most famous real-world examples comes from the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Stalin didn't just execute his political enemies, he erased them from history. Take Leon Trotsky, one of the key figures of the Russian Revolution. He fought alongside Lenin and helped shape the Soviet Union. But after Stalin took power, Trotsky became his biggest rival. Stalin had him assassinated, but that wasn't enough. He needed Trotsky erased from memory itself. So what did they do? Textbooks were rewritten, photographs were edited, statues were destroyed. Any mention of Trotsky was removed, and over time, new generations grew up never knowing he existed. But it wasn't just Trotsky. Stalin's government erased entire groups of people. There are famous Soviet photographs where people were literally scrubbed out. You can see their faded outlines, like ghosts in history. And it's not just dictatorships that do this. Even democratic countries shape history to fit their own narratives. Think about history textbooks. In different countries, the same historical event might be told in completely different ways. The Vietnam War is seen as a justified war in some countries, and a brutal imperialist failure in others. Colonial history is often whitewashed, with entire atrocities left out or downplayed. Even the Holocaust, one of the most well-documented genocides in history, has been denied and rewritten by some groups. So, here's the paradox. If history is written by those in power, then what is the truth? If records can be changed, if facts can be erased, then do we really have an accurate view of the past? Or are we just seeing the version of history we're meant to believe? Now, let's bring this to the modern world. In the past, people could find old books, hidden documents, and physical records to uncover the truth. But today, with everything going digital, what happens when history can be changed with the click of a button? Governments, corporations, and media companies own the information we consume. If they wanted to, they could alter history instantly. Think about news articles disappearing, search results being manipulated, and entire events being erased from online archives. If the internet is the world's memory, then who controls that memory? Imagine a future where AI generates fake historical records, where events are not just erased, but replaced with fabricated ones, where in a matter of seconds, an entire war, a revolution, or a crime never happened, because the data says so. Could there come a time when the past itself becomes unstable, where reality can be altered not through war or destruction, but simply by changing a few lines of data? This isn't just a thought experiment, it's already happening. China's Great Firewall censors historical events like the Tiananmen Square massacre, making sure younger generations never hear about it. In North Korea, history books claim their leaders invented modern technology, a total rewriting of reality. Even in the West, social media platforms quietly remove certain historical narratives, deciding what's true and what's misinformation. So, I'll leave you with this question. If history is constantly being rewritten, then how do we know what's real? How do we trust that the history we are taught is actually what happened? So let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. We live in a world where progress is seen as the ultimate goal. Every year, new technologies, new discoveries, and new ways of living make life easier, safer, and more efficient. But what if I told you that progress itself could be a trap? That the very things that help us grow might one day be the same things that lead to our downfall. This is the progress trap paradox, the idea that sometimes a civilization advances so much that it creates problems it can't solve. And when that happens, collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Let's start at the beginning. For most of human history, we were hunters and gatherers. We lived in small tribes, moved from place to place, and only took what we needed from nature. It was a hard life, but it was also sustainable. Humans lived that way for over 200,000 years without destroying their environment. Then, about 10,000 years ago, everything changed. We discovered agriculture, the ability to grow our own food. At first, this seemed like the greatest advancement in human history. No more wandering, no more uncertainty. People could settle in one place, build cities, store food, and support larger populations. But here's the paradox. The very thing that helped us grow also created massive new problems. Farming led to overpopulation, which led to competition for land and resources. Permanent settlements led to disease outbreaks because people were living closer together and near animals. Food surpluses created social hierarchies, leading to inequality, kings, and empires. And as civilizations expanded, war became inevitable, because now land and resources were worth fighting for. In other words, agriculture trapped us in a cycle of problems that never existed before. And the worst part? Once we took that step forward, there was no going back. No civilization could survive by abandoning farming once it had started. Did we really advance? Or did we create a new kind of suffering that locked us into a path we could never escape? Fast forward a few thousand years. The next big jump in human progress was the Industrial Revolution, the birth of machines, factories, and mass production. At first, it seemed like another huge leap forward. Machines made life easier, production became faster, and economies exploded. But once again, this new progress came with a cost. People became trapped in wage labor, working long hours in factories under brutal conditions. The demand for coal and oil led to massive environmental destruction. Cities grew faster than they could handle, leading to overcrowding, poverty, and crime. And most importantly, society became dependent on technology, meaning that if these systems ever failed, millions would suffer. Today, we look back and celebrate the Industrial Revolution. But if you lived during that time, you probably wouldn't see it as a blessing. You'd see child labor, pollution, poverty, and factories turning human lives into cogs in a machine. So again, was this really progress? Or was it another trap, a step forward that we could never take back, even if we wanted to? Now, let's talk about today, because right now, we are on the verge of another progress trap. Technology is advancing at a rate we've never seen before. Artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics are changing everything. But if history teaches us anything, it's that every new leap forward comes with consequences we don't see until it's too late. Think about what's happening. AI is replacing human jobs, and soon, entire industries might become obsolete. Social media and digital technology are creating mental health crises we don't fully understand. Advances in genetics and biotechnology could lead to new forms of human control, where governments and corporations decide who gets to live longer or be more intelligent. Climate change, fueled by the very industries that advance society, is now threatening our survival. We are moving forward faster than ever, but are we walking into a trap? A point where the world we've created can't sustain itself? So, here's the paradox. Every great civilization that has collapsed was brought down not by external forces, but by its own success. The Mayans overexploited their land. The Romans became too dependent on their systems. The industrial world created pollution and inequality that are now impossible to reverse. So now, here we are, facing our biggest progress trap yet: AI, automation, and an unstable planet. Are we building a future that will destroy itself? Is there a way out of the trap, or are we just walking the same doomed path as the civilizations before us? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. This is the doublethink paradox, the idea that people can hold two completely opposite beliefs and accept both as true, even if they logically cancel each other out. Sounds impossible, right? But trust me, this paradox is everywhere, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The term doublethink was made famous by George Orwell in his novel 1984. In Orwell's dystopian world, the ruling government, Big Brother, controls people's thoughts by making them believe contradictory ideas without questioning them. They repeat slogans like, "War is peace," "Freedom is slavery," "Ignorance is strength." At first glance, these phrases make no sense. How can war be peace? How can freedom be slavery? But in Orwell's world, the government controls reality itself. If they say war brings peace and repeat it enough times, people stop questioning it. They believe both things at the same time, even though one should cancel the other out. Now, you might be thinking, that's just fiction. People aren't actually like that in real life. But hold up, bro. This paradox happens every single day. Governments, corporations, media, and even individuals engage in doublethink all the time. Think about these statements. We must protect freedom of speech, but certain opinions should be banned. We fight for democracy, but we support dictators when it benefits us. Our economy is stronger than ever, but most people are struggling financially. These statements completely contradict themselves, yet they are repeated so often that people accept both as true. Governments use doublethink to control narratives. They tell people that losing rights makes them safer, or that spying on citizens is necessary for freedom. And somehow, people accept it, even though it doesn't make sense. This paradox isn't just about modern politics. It has shaped entire civilizations. The Roman Empire saw itself as the bringer of peace, yet it constantly waged war, enslaved people, and crushed rebellions. The Catholic Church during the Middle Ages preached love and forgiveness, yet it launched brutal crusades, persecuted heretics, and tortured those who didn't agree with its teachings. Even in Nazi Germany, propaganda convinced people that their country was fighting for peace and security, even as it committed horrific acts of violence. Citizens who should have known better accepted both ideas at the same time, because when a society normalizes doublethink, people stop noticing the contradictions. So why do people fall for doublethink? Why do we accept contradictions even when they are right in front of us? It's because the human brain prefers comfort over logic. If believing in two opposite things at the same time allows someone to avoid stress, punishment, or social rejection, they will do it without realizing it. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. When a person holds two conflicting beliefs, their brain adjusts reality to avoid discomfort. Instead of questioning the contradiction, they accept both as true because it's easier. And here's the scary part. Once you've been conditioned to accept one contradiction, you become blind to others. The more people get used to doublethink, the easier it becomes to control them. Now, think about today's world. Governments tell people to question everything, except when they tell you not to. Media companies claim to provide unbiased truth, but are funded by political and corporate interests. Technology promises to make life simpler, yet somehow, we're more stressed and overworked than ever. Is it possible that modern society has trained us to accept contradictions without realizing it? Are we living in an age where truth no longer matters because reality is just what we're told to believe? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. This is the empire paradox, the idea that no matter how powerful, wealthy, or dominant an empire becomes, it will eventually fall. Every great civilization reaches a point where it seems invincible, only to collapse, often from the very things that made it strong in the first place. At its peak, an empire looks unstoppable. It has a strong military, a booming economy, cultural influence, and a population that believes it will last forever. But history tells us that no empire lasts forever, and the bigger they get, the harder they fall. Look at ancient Egypt. For over 3,000 years, the pharaohs ruled over one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. They built massive pyramids, developed complex writing systems, and created an empire so powerful that even today we still talk about it. But eventually, Egypt fell, not because of a single event, but because of slow internal decay. Corrupt leadership, economic collapse, and invasions by outside forces chipped away at what was once an unstoppable empire. The very system that made Egypt great, its centralized rule, its reliance on the Nile, and its rigid social structure, became the reason it couldn't adapt when times changed. The Roman Empire is another perfect example. Rome was the superpower of the ancient world. It had advanced engineering, a disciplined army, and a culture that spread across 3 continents. For centuries, Romans believed their empire would last forever. They had conquered so much land that they called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. But despite its dominance, Rome fell. And it wasn't just one reason. It was a combination of many things. The government became corrupt. The economy weakened due to overspending. Military expansion stretched their resources too thin. And worst of all, Romans became too comfortable, too dependent on slaves and conquests, too unwilling to change their systems. The same pattern repeats with almost every major empire in history. The Ottoman Empire ruled for over 600 years, then crumbled due to internal struggles and outdated systems. The British Empire, once the most powerful global force, declined after World War II when it could no longer maintain control over its colonies. And now let's talk about today. If history teaches us that every empire eventually collapses, what does that mean for the United States, for China, or for the global powers of today? Are we watching the next great fall in real time? Many historians argue that modern superpowers are already showing the same warning signs as past fallen empires. Economic inequality is skyrocketing. Political corruption is everywhere. Military spending is at an all-time high, while basic services struggle to function. And just like Rome, modern societies are becoming too comfortable, too divided, and too dependent on systems that may not last forever. So here's the real paradox. If every empire in history has collapsed, does that mean that no empire can ever truly last? Is every great power doomed to fall, no matter how strong it seems? And if that's the case, are we just waiting for history to repeat itself? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. This is the power corruption paradox. The idea that the very people who rise to power to fix a broken system often become the very thing they fought against. Think about it. History is filled with leaders who start as revolutionaries, promising justice, equality, and freedom. They rally the people, overthrow oppressive governments, and swear that they will lead with fairness. But over time, something changes. The power they once saw as a tool for good becomes a tool for control. The very system they fought to destroy becomes the system they now maintain, and often in an even worse form. One of the best examples of this paradox is the French Revolution. In 1789, the people of France rose up against King Louis XVI and the corrupt monarchy. They demanded liberty, equality, and an end to tyranny. The revolution was supposed to bring democracy, justice, and a fair society. But what happened instead? After the monarchy was overthrown, the revolutionaries turned on each other. The same people who had fought for freedom started executing their own citizens in what became known as the Reign of Terror. Thousands of people, many of whom had supported the revolution, were sent to the guillotine under the rule of Maximilien Robespierre. He had started as a champion of the people. Yet, by the end of his rule, he had become just as brutal as the king he had replaced. And then, just a few years later, France, now free from monarchy, ended up with an emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had once fought for the revolution, took absolute power and crowned himself Emperor of France. The people had traded one absolute ruler for another, exactly what they had fought against. This same pattern repeats throughout history. In Russia, the people overthrew the oppressive rule of the Tsars in 1917, hoping for a more equal society under communism. But instead of freedom, they ended up with Stalin, whose rule led to mass executions, forced labor camps, and complete state control. In Cuba, Fidel Castro started as a revolutionary hero fighting against dictatorship. But once he gained power, he never gave it up, ruling for nearly 50 years with strict control over his people. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe led the fight against colonial rule, only to become a dictator himself, crushing opposition and destroying his country's economy. So why does this happen? Why do leaders who start with good intentions become the very tyrants they once opposed? Power is addictive. When someone first gains power, they tell themselves that they need to use it for good. They might even believe that. But over time, they start to think, if I step down, everything I built will collapse. They convince themselves that only they can keep order, that only they know what's best. So they hold on to power longer and longer, and soon they start doing the exact things they once fought against. But it's not just individual leaders, it's entire governments and systems. A revolution that starts as a fight for justice often becomes a government that silences dissent. A democracy that promises freedom slowly adds more surveillance, more control, more restrictions, all in the name of safety. And before you know it, the system is just as bad or worse than the one that came before it. Here's the real paradox. If power always leads to corruption, then is there any system that can truly remain just and fair? If every revolution eventually becomes the new oppression, then is there any escape from the cycle? Or is every government, no matter how well-intentioned, doomed to become corrupt? This is the historical loop paradox. The idea that history doesn't just move forward, it cycles. The same mistakes, the same conflicts, and even the same types of leaders keep appearing, just in different forms. And the most terrifying part? Even when we think we've learned from the past, we end up making the same choices again. Let's start with something you've probably heard before. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That quote is from philosopher George Santayana, and it perfectly sums up this paradox. But here's the real question. What if remembering history isn't enough? What if no matter how much we study the past, we are trapped in a cycle we can't escape? Think about war. Humanity has fought wars for thousands of years. Ancient civilizations fought over land, power, and resources. The Middle Ages were filled with conflicts between empires and kingdoms. Then came the World Wars, where entire nations were nearly destroyed. After World War II, people swore, never again. Yet since then, we've seen the Cold War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless others. Every time a war ends, leaders say it was the war to end all wars. But then another one begins. It's not just war. Revolutions follow the same cycle. A group of people rises up against oppression. They overthrow the system, a new leader takes over, and over time, that new leader becomes the oppressor. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, all started with the promise of freedom, only to fall into dictatorship, corruption, or violence. Economic cycles also follow the loop. Every few decades, economies boom, wealth grows, and people feel unstoppable. Then suddenly, a crash happens. Stock markets collapse, banks fail, and entire economies fall apart. The Great Depression of 1929, the dot-com bubble of the 2000s, the 2008 financial crisis, it happens again and again. Economists try to predict it. Governments try to stop it. But somehow, we always end up back in the same situation. Even leaders repeat history. We see the same types of rulers rise to power over and over. A charismatic leader promises change, gets elected, and then becomes corrupt. A dictator takes control, rules with an iron fist, and then gets overthrown, only for another dictator to rise years later. Rome had Julius Caesar, France had Napoleon, Germany had Hitler, and in every case, people believed this time is different until it wasn't. So, here's the real paradox. If history repeats itself, can we ever truly progress? Or are we just running in circles, believing we're moving forward when we're really just playing out the same events over and over? And if we are in a cycle, then where are we right now? Are we heading toward another economic collapse, another major war, another fall of an empire? Or is there actually a way to break the loop and finally move forward? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. This is the Lost Invention Paradox. The idea that throughout history, civilizations have discovered incredible technologies, only to lose them entirely, sometimes for centuries or even forever. We like to think of human progress as a straight line, one invention building on another, leading to more advanced civilizations over time. But what if that's not true? What if instead of a straight line, history is actually filled with lost knowledge, forgotten breakthroughs, and entire scientific discoveries that were erased before they could change the world? Let's start with something shocking: the Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, divers off the coast of Greece found a mysterious, corroded device inside a sunken shipwreck. At first, people thought it was just a chunk of metal, but when scientists examined it closely, they discovered something unbelievable. It was a mechanical computer built over 2,000 years ago by the ancient Greeks. This device could track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets with incredible precision. It had bronze gears, complex mechanics, and calculations that were centuries ahead of its time. But here's the real question. If the Greeks built something this advanced, why was it lost? Why did humanity take nearly 1,500 years to develop anything remotely similar? And this isn't an isolated case. The Romans had the knowledge to build steam engines, not just bathhouses and aqueducts, but actual machines that could have started an industrial revolution almost 2,000 years before it actually happened. They even built small working models, but instead of developing them, they relied on slave labor for everything. With no economic need for machines, the knowledge was abandoned. The idea of steam-powered machines disappeared for centuries, only to be rediscovered in the 18th century. The Baghdad battery is another mystery. Discovered in Iraq, these ancient clay jars, dating back over 2,000 years, contained a copper cylinder and an iron rod. Some scientists believe they could have been used as batteries to generate small amounts of electricity. But if ancient civilizations understood electricity, why didn't this knowledge spread? Why was it forgotten? Then there's Damascus steel, a metal so strong and sharp that swords made from it were said to cut through iron like butter. Warriors of the Middle Ages prized it above all else. Yet, at some point in history, the technique to create Damascus steel was lost. Modern scientists have tried to replicate it, but no one has been able to create the exact same quality of steel that existed hundreds of years ago. And it's not just technology. Entire fields of medical knowledge have been lost and rediscovered. Ancient Egyptians performed brain surgeries, yet medieval Europe treated illnesses with leeches and bloodletting. The Romans had concrete that could last for thousands of years, yet when the empire fell, that knowledge was lost, and Europe wouldn't figure out how to make concrete again until the 19th century. So, here's the terrifying question. If history is full of lost inventions, what else have we forgotten? Could there have been entire civilizations that advanced beyond what we even imagine, only for their knowledge to be wiped out completely? And if so, how many times has this happened before? Some researchers believe that massive global disasters, wars, plagues, and natural catastrophes have wiped out entire knowledge bases before they could be passed down. If a catastrophe happened today, how much of our modern technology would survive? Without factories, without power grids, and without global communication, how long would it take for humans to relearn what we know now? And here's the real paradox. If knowledge can be lost so easily, how do we know it won't happen again? Are we as advanced as we think, or are we just another civilization in a cycle of discovering, losing, and rediscovering technology? Could it be that we're not at the peak of human advancement, but just another civilization building up to be forgotten? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's move on to our next paradox. This is the forbidden knowledge paradox. The idea that some knowledge is so powerful, so dangerous, or so disruptive that those in power have actively worked to suppress it. We like to believe that progress is about discovery, that once we find something new, it stays in the history books, and we keep moving forward. But history suggests something very different. There are countless examples of knowledge being erased, books being burned, and entire discoveries being hidden, only to be rediscovered centuries later. One of the most famous examples of this paradox is the Library of Alexandria. This was the greatest center of knowledge in the ancient world, containing scrolls and manuscripts from civilizations all across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Historians believe that it housed countless discoveries, scientific theories, medical breakthroughs, and maybe even technologies that were far ahead of their time. Then, suddenly, it was destroyed. To this day, no one knows exactly how it happened, whether it was burned in a war, destroyed by religious fanatics, or simply erased by rulers who feared what was inside. What we do know is this: when the library was lost, so was an unknown amount of ancient knowledge. Knowledge that could have advanced humanity centuries ahead of where we are now. But this wasn't just a one-time event. Throughout history, there have been mass book burnings, censorship campaigns, and the systematic destruction of knowledge. The Catholic Church once banned entire fields of study that contradicted religious teachings. Governments throughout history have erased entire events from history books. Even in modern times, controversial discoveries can be hidden or discredited if they challenge the status quo. Take Nikola Tesla, for example. Tesla was one of the most brilliant inventors of all time, developing wireless electricity, early radio technology, and even ideas for free energy that could have changed the world. Yet, after he died, many of his papers and inventions vanished. Some claim that his most revolutionary ideas were silenced because they threatened the profits of powerful energy companies. Then there's the story of the Great Pyramid of Giza. For centuries, mainstream historians told us that it was simply a tomb built by the Egyptians. But when researchers began discovering that the pyramid's dimensions match planetary and mathematical constants with impossible accuracy, the findings were ignored or dismissed. Why? Because if the pyramids weren't just tombs, that would mean ancient civilizations had far more advanced knowledge than we thought. And that changes everything. Even now, we see the suppression of knowledge happening in real time. Governments control access to classified information, tech companies manipulate search results, and certain historical narratives are either pushed to the front or erased entirely. So here's the real paradox. If knowledge is power, and those in power control knowledge, then do we ever truly know the full story? What discoveries have been made and then deliberately buried? What if history itself has been rewritten so that we only see what we are meant to see? And if so, what knowledge is still being hidden from us today? This is the control versus chaos paradox, the idea that every attempt to create a perfectly controlled and stable society inevitably leads to collapse, rebellion, or unintended consequences. It's the paradox of order. The more control a system enforces, the closer it comes to breaking. At first, this might not seem obvious. After all, isn't control what keeps societies functioning? Governments create laws, economies regulate trade, and people follow rules so that everything runs smoothly. But history shows that too much control always leads to the opposite result: chaos, resistance, and collapse. Let's break this down. Throughout history, some of the most powerful empires, governments, and institutions have tried to control every aspect of life, and every single one of them eventually fell apart. The more they tried to tighten their grip, the more people resisted. The more they tried to create a system that would last forever, the faster it crumbled. Look at the Soviet Union. It was one of the most controlled societies in modern history. The government controlled the economy, the media, education, and even people's personal lives. Dissent was silenced, everything was planned, and there was no room for independent thought. On the surface, this system seemed stable, but under the surface, cracks were forming. People hated being controlled. They found ways to rebel: underground literature, illegal markets, secret gatherings. The government, in response, tightened control even more. They increased surveillance, cracked down on protests, and made the rules even stricter. But instead of strengthening the system, this only made people more desperate to break free. And then, in 1991, after decades of totalitarian rule, the Soviet Union collapsed almost overnight. A system that seemed unbreakable shattered under its own weight. This same paradox played out in Imperial China. The Qing dynasty built an incredibly rigid and centralized system that lasted for centuries. Every aspect of life was controlled: what people could wear, how they could work, even what they could think. And for a while, it seemed like this control would last forever. But as the world modernized, China refused to adapt. The government tightened restrictions instead of allowing change, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, rebellions erupted. Eventually, the dynasty collapsed, and a system that had lasted for thousands of years was gone. Even in the Roman Empire, we see the same pattern. In the early days of Rome, society was flexible. People had a voice, laws could be changed, and innovation was welcomed. But as Rome expanded, its rulers started fearing rebellion. They created stricter and stricter laws, crushed dissent, and increased military control. Instead of preventing collapse, this weakened the empire from within. Citizens felt like they were being ruled by force rather than by leadership. And eventually, Rome crumbled under its own weight. The paradox is this: control is necessary for order, but too much control creates the very chaos it tries to prevent. But here's where it gets really terrifying. This paradox isn't just something from history. It's happening right now in modern societies. Governments today are using mass surveillance, data tracking, and censorship in ways never seen before. Everything we do online is monitored, recorded, and analyzed. Social media algorithms decide what information we see. Laws about misinformation determine which opinions are allowed and which are silenced. And here's the big question: are we heading toward another collapse? Are modern governments creating too much control in an attempt to maintain stability? And if history tells us that too much control leads to chaos, then how long before we see the next great breakdown of a system that seems unbreakable? And here's the most uncomfortable part of this paradox: there is no solution. If you create too much control, you risk collapse. But if you allow too much freedom, society becomes chaotic and unstable. So, how do we find the balance? Can we ever create a society that doesn't destroy itself? Or are we just waiting for the next empire to fall? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. This is the existence versus extinction paradox. The idea that every successful species, civilization, or system creates the very conditions that lead to its own destruction. At first glance, this sounds crazy. After all, when something thrives, shouldn't it continue to grow and evolve? Shouldn't success lead to more success? That's what we've been told. But history, science, and even nature suggest that everything that flourishes eventually plants the seeds of its own collapse. Let's start with civilizations. The most successful societies in history, Rome, Egypt, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, didn't fall because of an outside enemy. They fell because their very success created weaknesses that they couldn't escape from. Rome became so powerful that it spread itself too thin. Its vast empire required huge resources, a massive military, and complex infrastructure. But as Rome expanded, it became harder to control. It started relying on foreign mercenaries instead of its own soldiers, overtaxing its citizens and drowning in corruption. The very things that made Rome great, its size, its military, its wealth, ended up becoming its greatest vulnerabilities. The same thing happened to the Soviet Union. It started as a revolution, promising equality and progress. At first, it grew rapidly, becoming a superpower. But as it became more controlled and centralized, its economy stagnated, its people became restless, and the entire system collapsed under its own weight. But here's where this paradox gets even bigger, because it doesn't just apply to civilizations. It applies to entire species, including us. Take the dinosaurs. They dominated the planet for millions of years, becoming the most successful species Earth had ever seen. But their dominance made them dependent on a stable environment. When a sudden disaster, most likely an asteroid, hit the planet, they were too specialized, too big, and too slow to adapt. The same success that made them rule the Earth made them vulnerable to extinction. And now, let's talk about us, humanity. We are the most intelligent species on Earth. We have technology, medicine, global communication, and space exploration. We have built civilizations that would have been unimaginable just a few centuries ago. But here's the terrifying question. Is our own success leading us toward extinction? Look at what's happening. We've advanced so much that we now control nuclear weapons capable of wiping out life on Earth. We've developed AI that could one day outthink us. We've created an economic system that depends on constant growth, even though our planet's resources are limited. Climate change, economic collapse, wars, overpopulation, these aren't just random problems. They are the direct result of human success. Our ability to conquer nature, build civilizations, and dominate the planet has also created the risks that could wipe us out. And here's the real paradox. Do all advanced civilizations eventually reach a point where they destroy themselves? This isn't just a theory. Scientists have proposed something called the Great Filter Hypothesis. The idea that the reason we don't see intelligent alien civilizations across the universe is because every advanced species eventually destroys itself before it can spread beyond its home planet. So, here's the final, most mind-blowing question. Is humanity already past the danger point? Or are we on the brink of self-destruction? And if this paradox is true, then is there any way to escape it? Or are we just another species following the same pattern, rising to greatness only to fall because of our own success? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.